Hi, this is Dr. Coates. As you can see, I'm at home. My daughter Frances was ill today, so I stayed home to look after her, and that's one of the reasons why this is getting uploaded a little bit later than I like to do it. Also, you'll no doubt notice that the picture quality is nowhere near our normal, somewhat high standards. Although I don't know, perhaps this means the sound will not be out of sync. Who knows? Anyway, so my apologies on any graininess about the picture, or if the sound sounds like I'm in an amphitheater. I'm not. I'm just in our spare bedroom at the house. One thing I guess I want to, there are a few things I'd like to say. First of all, I want to apologize to everyone for any of the problem that happened with Blackboard that made it impossible for you to actually view the rubric along with the exam. My understanding is that should be corrected for the next exam. And it had to do with my trying to edit the actual test in order to redistribute the amount of points that went to each particular question. So now I know that I just need to leave the test alone and manually redo the point spreads within a different part of the Blackboard editor, which I don't really need to get into anything about. All I guess I should say is that this hadn't happened to me before, that I wanted to curve an exam that I'd given on Blackboard, and so I was unfamiliar with how to do it. I did ask several people about how to do it beforehand. Our expertise about this particular matter is apparently not very profound. But the good news is it probably won't happen for the next exam. Speaking of which, the next exam on the syllabus, it says that it's going to be this Sunday night, and having now had a chance to look very carefully at all of your journal entries, I saw one brilliant suggestion which said that, something along these lines: it seems as though you are expecting we'll have a lot more time on the weekend to complete one of these exams. That is actually not true for me. This person worked on the weekend, and it would have actually been a lot easier for them. So what I'd like to do is to extend the due date, keeping in mind that this is still one of those situations where I post the exam and then you just pick an hour. So having a longer span of time to complete the exam in doesn't actually mean that you have, necessarily more time to study for it or more time to complete it, more to the point. It just means that you get to choose the hour which is best for you. So if that is Monday night, then I want to give you that opportunity. So I'm gonna have the first exam now be collected on Tuesday night, although I will post it pretty much at the normal time. I'm thinking it's going to be probably Friday night that I'll post it. Although I guess I can't make any promises about that, because the other announcement I want to make is that I'm actually giving an hour-long presentation about this particular class and how well it's going tomorrow at noon, which I'm actually quite nervous about and I've been preparing for the majority of this week and the previous week. So because of that, I'm going to be spending most of tonight working on that, making the Prezi that I'll be presenting at this hour-long showcase talk. And if you like, I can also make it available to all of you, because it is about your work. I only say nice things about you, of course. But because of that, I haven't actually started writing the exam yet. I will do that Friday night. And let's say I'm going to guarantee by Saturday during my daughter's nap. So that would be about 3 p.m. For the latest date on Saturday afternoon for when the second exam would be posted. But then you would have until Tuesday at midnight to find an hour time. And I'm hoping that I'm threading the needle. If you have, if it is true that you work insane hours during the weekdays, right, and weekends are better for you, you would still have Saturday evening and all day Sunday to work with. If the weekends are really difficult for you, then you would have Monday Monday evening, and any time that you could finagle on Tuesday in order to try to take the exam. So I'm just trying to be flexible and meet your schedules where they are. Having a really busy work schedule or working multiple jobs in order to go to college is one of the reasons that we have anticipated students take all online classes. So if this makes your life even a little bit easier, then it's of course worth it. Okay, I guess the next announcement is that I've gone ahead and posted midterm grades for you. The withdrawal deadline is actually not until the 22nd, so it's a week from tomorrow. Having said that, my recommendation is that no one in this class should withdraw. If you have been turning anything in at all, sorry, forget that. And unless you have not turned in the first exam or any participated on Twitter at all, or let's see, or not submitted any journal entries or not done any work on the wiki. I'm pleased to report that, except for one student who's still on the roster, but I don't think is actually doing these lectures anymore, there are 25 of you who are still actively and I think intensely participating in this class, and that's one of the things I'm going to boast about in my talk tomorrow, that the online environment, as off-putting as it can be sometimes, does seem, in your case at least, to have really engaged you, and so my job is to keep you engaged. So, what I would say to you is keep doing what you're doing. There are 3 more exams, which includes the final exam. 3 more exams. If you are not happy with your first exam score, there are going to be a total of 5 modules. If there was something that you forgot to do in the first or second module for participation, you'll note that if you never turned in a journal entry, I couldn't assess anything, so I had to put it at a 0. But that doesn't mean all you do then is you pick up the slack for the other writing and journal entries, remembering to turn those in on time for the rest of these modules, and it's going to be very easy to keep your participation grade up to where you want it, just based on keeping up with the participation standards that we've set. So I hope no one is alarmed by the midterm grade. On the other hand, I guess I should also say, if you're extremely pleased by your midterm grade, then that doesn't mean that now you get to coast for the rest of the semester. So, kind of like keep doing what you're doing does apply in both cases. But on the whole, again, I'm very, very pleased with how the class is going. I hope you are too. If you are not, then I'm always open and ready to speak with you about any strategies that I could suggest to help you get your grade back up where you want it to be. So, all right. Having said that, I am going to launch into the second of 2 lectures on Imagism, and this concludes this week. And to remind you that the fake poets tweeting is still going on, and you do have a Friday evening journal post that you're responsible for. I will be unlocking Module 4 very soon. Oh, I'm sorry, one last thing. The midterm grade only covered the first 2 modules of participation and the first exam. So Module 3, since it's not complete yet, I haven't actually commented on your journal posts or assessed your participation yet, so that's another thing I wanted to clear up. So Module 3 participation is going to go in there, Module 4 and 5 are still coming. There's going to be a group illustration project, which will be rolled out along with, actually I think I'll save it until after you turn in your second exam on Tuesday night, but it's, that'll be another opportunity to bring the grade up too. Okay, so the second lecture on Imagism is going to be concentrating on what I call the politics of minimalism. And on Tuesday, you'll remember that I was talking about Imagism mostly in terms of its brevity, which of course is a sort of startling thing that everyone has to be confronted with whenever they see an Imagist poem for the first time, like The Red Wheelbarrow, or This Is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams. Or there's this beautiful poem by Robert Frost, who was, in some ways at least, influenced by Imagism, called The Span of Life, and I'm going to quote it in its entirety. The old dog barks backward without getting up. That's the first line. I can remember when he was a pup. That's it. That's the 2 lines. So even if a poet writing around the 1910s and 20s did not categorize him or herself as being an Imagist poet, there was still this possibility for influence. And indeed, the Wallace Stevens poems that are in this module, The Snowman from last week, and also 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, which is a wonderful little poem, and I think a good candidate for what it would look like if you wanted to string multiple Imagist poems together and form like one big mega Imagist poem. I would not classify Stevens or Frost as an Imagist, neither would they. But the fact that they were experimenting with ways of paring down some of the flourishes and the frillery of some of their earlier poems, and just giving you the bare minimum, does represent an influence of Imagism. So anyway, there's more to it than just brevity, though. You will not be surprised to find that the Imagists themselves saw the movement as stripping away the unnecessary accoutrements that had grown up around poems, like an invasive weed, an English ivy, if you will, over the centuries. The Imagists, even wrote manifestos explaining their choices, the most famous of which is called A Few Don'ts by an Imagiste by Ezra Pound, in many ways sort of impresario who's behind this movement, which contains the memorable definition that the image, according to the Imagists, is, quote, that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. Intellectual and emotional simultaneity, it will turn out, mean pretty specific things to Pound, which may not be shared by the rest of the Imagists. But the nature of a manifesto is to speak for a movement rather than just for the individual author who is writing the manifesto. And indeed, sometimes it's like they're written by committee, so you can't even you can't guarantee all the time for a manifesto that there's going to be just one author. Here's another definition of the image, again as the Imagists defined it, from F.S. Flint's book Imagism. Okay, it has 3 bullet points. The first one: direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. And 3, as regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. And for those of you who have never played the piano, the metronome is that little thing that has like a ticking back and forth mechanism. They're very, very old machines as machines go, but they're basically there to keep time in case you're having difficulty in your first year or 2 of piano, keeping track of tempo. So that sort of musical phrases obviously can also have regular beats, but by contrasting the musical phrase from the metronome, they are saying that meter which is regular merely for the sake of being regular, such as the iambic pentameter that you saw in a lot of Victorian poetry, the generation that came right before the Imagists, was not at all musical in the same way that they wanted to find musical, I think, meaning pleasurable. So, and that's the end of the F.S. Flint dogma for what it means to be an Imagist. So in Imagism, you see a poetic school which is completely rejecting conventional prescriptions for what poetry is or what it ought to be. Not necessarily a refusal to rhyme, but certainly a refusal of the obligation to rhyme. It's not necessarily a refusal or rejection of meter, but a refusal of the obligation to be metrically regular, and so on, right? Fighting back against rules, but not necessarily disliking what the rules were designed to promote, if that makes sense. In other words, Imagist poems are by and large free verse poems, and it will furthermore not surprise you, and this is the second time today, I guess, that you're having a non-surprise moment, that the advent of Imagism coincided with the popularization of free verse poetry at the beginning of the 20th century, largely thanks to the pioneering work of Walt Whitman in America in the later 1800s. So, Imagism is a subset of free verse poetry, but not every free verse poem is going to be an Imagist poem, right? You can imagine an extremely long free verse poem, for example. You can imagine a rambling free verse poem, where this is just a subset, right? So this is the extremely clipped, minimalist free verse poem, if you like. Imagist poems are brief, free verse lyrics about a moment's experience. At the movement's inception, Imagist poems were by poets who had trained themselves in classical and medieval foreign languages, and therefore had a chance to conceive of writing poetry outside of standard English metrical conventions. T.S. Eliot, for example, had been trained in 19th century French. Ezra Pound actually got a doctoral degree in Provençal languages, so like the language of medieval France. Arnaud Daniel, for example. Anyway, so having had that sort of immersion in other languages, it was much more natural for them to be thinking outside of the box, if the box is Victorian regular meter and the obligation to rhyme. They arrayed themselves against Victorian form and meter, but also Victorian diction, the sort of archaic, the these and thous, and thou dost array thyself again, the sort of very formal language that you would see in 19th century poetry. A prejudice against which was so strong, I think, that many students and readers of poetry still have it today. Which is not to say that nothing in the 19th century that was poetry was good, certainly. It's just that because there was such a hard right turn away from the types of language you see in the Victorian poetry, we tend not to see it very, very much anymore. So here's what Ford Madox Ford had to say about a poem by Tennyson. Here's a quote: "It went on and on, and on, a long rolling stream of words which no one would ever use, to endless, monotonous, polysyllabic, unchanging rhythms." Unquote. Or, and here he is in 1921, this is still Ford, quote, "the polysyllabic, honey-dripping, derivative adjectives that make 19th century poetry as a whole seem greasy and close," unquote. Right? And again, that's Ford. I'm not saying that 19th century poetry is bad in the same way that he really, really is saying it. But in exploding conventional forms of poetry, the newly christened vers libre, and I'll go in just a second to why they would want to say vers libre, which is verse which is free in French, rather than saying free verse, not French verse. It found itself beset by another problem. If male poets were already worried about the relationship to other professions, other male professions, that is, you know, if you're thinking about as male poets of the turn of the 20th century were, if you're thinking about poetry writing as being a somewhat emasculating profession because you kind of, you know, sit on your butt all day and write rather than digging ditches or, you know, erecting buildings or something like that. W.B. Yeats, for example, in a poem called Adam's Curse in 1907, called poetry writing an idle trade. And later on in his 1928 poem, The Tower, he called it the sedentary trade, lazy, basically. So if they're already feeling, if male poets are already feeling that sort of anxiety, then the opportunities of free verse were also matched with another problem, one of further emasculation. So the problem there is that free verse was no longer rarefying poetry until it could only be written by men with a huge amount of literary training. You didn't have to go, you know, through the English public school system, which meant that you were being taught ancient Greek and Latin literature, you know, which by definition, therefore, you know, the women that you would marry, or, you know, like your sisters and cousins, sisters and female cousins, would not be able to know what you're talking about, and so you're kind of excluding a whole gender from all of your literary conversations. Well, since that's changing, so that English literature is being taught within classes, and now you're wanting everybody to write poetry in language that everybody would use, then unfortunately, I guess for the men, that also means now women are going to be able to write and publish poetry, at least much more so than they were before. So this was actually a problem that the literary marketplace of men was also rocked by in the mid-19th century because, I don't know if you know this, but novel writing actually had a really bad reputation when it was first developed in the mid-18th century, because it was thought that novels could corrupt the minds of women. Then in the mid-19th century, you know, when you have like the greats of the 19th century novel, like Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, George Eliot, Charles Dickens, and so forth. I mean, I know Dickens is male, but many of those names I was just naming are women. And so the reputation of that particular genre was fairly low, because it was assumed that women would only write about women's issues, and so men had an excuse not to read them, and they would read their poetry instead, perhaps ancient Latin poetry. Right? If you were a male novelist, then you had the problem of seeing that, you know, here's an actual really cool genre that you would like to write in, but it has this bad reputation and a somewhat emasculating reputation, at least just for the men. Women had no such problem. Anyway, this meant the advent of free verse. As with novels, most of which were written by women in the 19th century, anybody who could read could now write and, horas, publish poetry. And the floodgates were now open to the masses, the uneducated, unwashed masses. The new school of Imagism, then, set out to distinguish itself not just from the stultified and hollow conventions of the previous generation of poets, but to summon a high seriousness which would separate it from the other lower poems of the poetesses, the women who were writing poetry. In other words, the Imagist poems were quite sexist, even those Imagist poems that were written by women, like those by H.D., Hilda Doolittle. The great 20th century novelist James Joyce said of The Wasteland, which some view as an Imagist poem, it ends the idea of poetry for the ladies, unquote. And that was a compliment. William Carlos Williams had this quote, "Of sugar and spice and everything nice, that is what bad poetry is made of." Right? And then here's a quote by the reliably misogynistic Ezra Pound, quote, "Poetry speaks phallic direction." I love that quotation. Anyway, so when Imagists call for energy, motion, and power to be evident in every line of a poem in their manifestos, when they're talking about things being etched or chiseled as if they were, you know, a sharp edge or something like that, I think you've got to keep in mind too that there's a political element to all of that. They're trying to make free verse poem male-oriented art, free verse poetry into some sort of new male-oriented art in order to, you know, hide it away from the ladies, if you will. Sometimes brutal, potentially avant-garde, but always sexist. Imagism was Ezra Pound's brainchild to launch the careers of himself, mainly, he was a self-promoter, along with H.D., who was his one-time fiancée when they were both students at the University of Pennsylvania, and Richard Aldington, who was her current husband. They separated soon after World War I because he came back with shell shock. It coincided with an explosion of free verse writing, and when the American poet Amy Lowell became increasingly interested in wresting control of the movement away from Ezra Pound and broadening the scope of Imagism to include most free verse writing, Pound started the new purist school of Vorticism as a competitor. Vorticism, which is like a vortex. Yep. Even though the only difference between the two schools was that Vorticism consisted only of Pound's friends. So it's like Imagism and then Imagism Light, I guess. Pound regarded T.S. Eliot's famous poem The Wasteland as the quintessential vorticist poem, an act of appropriation few other people observed besides him. But in case you're curious to see what Imagism became under Amy Lowell's direction once Pound and company jumped ship and renamed themselves, the entirety of her 1915 anthology Some Imagist Poets is available online and it's Googleable, so I encourage you to read that if you're interested. Here are a few of my own general observations about the poems that we're reading for this week. 1. There's a strong recurrence of Greek themes and classical references, and I think this is a holdover from trying to write poetry that women could read, but still to carry over those much more historically and conventionally male subjects. So thinking about ancient Greece, it used to be something only for men in the 19th century at least. Okay, 2. There's a central governing conceit, which is occasionally a simile. We can call it a conceit because it's the only thing there, and remember, conceits are metaphors that take over a text and make it so that your main job as you're reading it is to figure out why this metaphor has been consistently employed in that way. But in other words, there is a comparison being made within the relatively brief span of this text. Occasionally that's a simile, as with In a Station of the Metro, but you're going to be finding figurative language within an Images poem. 3. There's exceptional brevity, often rendered as having been etched or chiseled like sculpture, and the way that the poem looks on the page is of paramount importance. And this is why I was saying in my lecture for Tuesday that Imagism is one of those inherently visual schools of poetry, and that's the reason it's on the syllabus. And then 4, and perhaps most importantly, there's an attempt, at least in poems by Pound, but I would say also in those by H.D. and Williams, to use the image to constrain signification, to try to lock down the ability of language to mean more things than what you might think you have meant. Like the unintentional double entendre is supposedly impossible within an Images poem because it's so short. Now this last point needs more explanation, I think. Pound actually seems to have believed that by minimizing the amount of information that's available within a poem, he could actually force the reader into the same mental state he was in when he wrote it. Or at least this is what he writes in his memoir, The Imagist Years, which he called Gaudier-Zerschke. The title comes from a friend of his who died during World War I by that same name. He was actually a Frenchman named Gaudier, and then he married a Polish countess whose last name was Zerschke, and so they both hyphenated their name. Anyway, he was a sculptor, and Pound thought of, I guess one thing that does differentiate Vorticism and Imagism was that Vorticism was meant to be interdisciplinary, so there were artists and sculptors and poets, manifesto writers, all novelists, all together, like feeding off of each other's creative energy. Anyway, so in this memoir, Pound basically, and I'm paraphrasing, says, what can a reader do in reading a poem like In a Station of the Metro except compare the petals on a wet black bough to the apparition of these faces in a crowd, right? I mean, if you wanted to do more with that, I guess you could, but you'd be doing it after the words have already ended. The span of the poem kind of forces you to see that there's this comparison that's trying to be made, grapple with it, and then you're done. You're done. You don't have as much chance, to try to willfully read things differently than it seems like they were intended. The fact that he should wish to constrain our interpretive freedom as readers says a lot about Pound, of course. But it should probably still feel odd to you that a poet would feel anxious about your ability as a reader to reinterpret an image as you see fit in order to make it comprehensible. Many of us think that this is one of the reasons why we go to literature, and that therefore authors have written it for us, to allow us to, come to the text in a sort of collective set of terms. Like, here's what the author brings, here's what the reader brings, and then something else happens. So to be thinking about it in terms of like master and student, if you're charitable, but slave as well, like, I'm going to make you think this, and then, okay, that kind of thing. That's kind of an odd situation to find yourself in when you're reading a poem. And, you know, to be fair, there's much to be said for a poem that can, within only 2 lines, still say an enormous amount about the disaffection of modern life, about the rapid changes within modernity that wrought by technology, about how once we might have lived together as individuals, by expressing ourselves, but tools of convenience like the subway have now made us into an undifferentiated mass of spectral blobs, little more than ghosts to one another rather than complete selves, and how there's an inherent violence that lurks behind that stripping of selfhood from riders of the subway, who often don't even face the direction that the cars are heading. And that inherent violence, by the way, is mirrored in the stripping of poetic artifice and conventions from more traditional poems that resulted in the poem that you are reading. Still, having said that, Pound is not a very friendly author, and it will not surprise you for the 3rd time today that he was actually quite an unpleasant person in real life. In fact, it's a little bit scandalous, and this is why I saved it for last, but if you were to look at the Wikipedia biography for Pound, you would see that later in life, after his Imagist phase, so something like 20 or 30 years after that, he actually left London, having left America for London, but then left London for Italy because he was so enamored of Benito Mussolini's politics. And he actually started broadcasting over radio to the U.S. troops during World War II, who were to lay down their arms and actually take up for Mussolini, which of course makes him a traitor. He was a traitor. So you can't really say that about very many poets, that they were traitors. Also, I just want to say there haven't been that many, trials for treason in our nation's history. Usually it's spies. But the reason for that, and treason, just to go off on a slight tangent here, treason is one of the things that is actually spelled out in the U.S. Constitution. It's really difficult to convict somebody of it because you have to have actual witnesses to a treasonous utterance. But unfortunately, because Ezra Pound was broadcasting live over the radio, anyone who heard it was a witness. So we had several 100,000 witnesses to his treason. Luckily for him, I guess, he was also committed to an insane asylum called St. Elizabeth's on a diagnosis of megalomania, but we could also just call it being a major jerk. So, okay, well that's the end of the lecture for today. No more on Imagism. And this is, we're going to take a break now from this more specific literary historical section and go back to speaking about different categories of poetry and the types of skills that you would need in order to read them. But first we're going to have this exam. So as you're thinking about the next exam, keep in mind that the essay rubric, which I have now emailed everybody about, that essay rubric is going to be exactly the same on the next exam. Of course, it'll be a different poem. It'll be a poem from the 3rd module that I'll be asking you to make a claim about. But you're still going to be making a claim. I'm sorry, you're still going to be taking a claim that I give you and supporting it. So multiple choice questions at the beginning, and then a short essay to prove on the claim of my provision. And I urge anyone who didn't set up their time in this way next time to do it this way. You have an hour. Roughly the 2 sections of the exam are weighted exactly the same. 50% on the multiple choice, 50% on the essay. If you find that the multiple choice questions are taking you longer than you thought, please do stop with them after 30 minutes and then come back to them later. You can come back to those questions. So leave yourself at least a half hour to complete the essay, because the essay is fully a half of your grade, and then come back to the multiple choice questions. I always think about them in terms of, if you have read through the poems at least once, if you're generally familiar with them, they probably should take you no more than 5 minutes per. Wait. 5 minutes per, that would be 45 minutes. No, okay. It has to be much less than that. I mean, the span of time that it actually takes you to read through the question. So that, I don't know, a minute per question? But that's me, and of course I write them. I just want you to know 30 minutes per section is a good way of thinking about it. And if you are a little bit more like me than not, and you get through the multiple choice section earlier, then spend more time on the essay, by all means. So having said that, of course, good luck on the second exam. I don't anticipate there'll be any changes about what I was telling you, but if there are, of course, I will email you about it. And please do contact me if you have anything above and beyond what would be included in those questions.